promises of reform and equality failed, the worker and student movements of 1968 and 1969, respectively, formed and took hold of the Italian public who advocated for violence first as a last resort. The student movement, the Sessantotto, was supposed to be a cultural revolution, pursuing modern education reforms and greater funding, but it ultimately failed to make any legislative changes. On the other hand, the Autunno Caldo, the worker strikes, did achieve labor and pay reforms. These movements were especially influential in the mid-70s when the feminist movement began as well. Consequently, it created a coalesced intersectional movement whose supporters soon became members of armed political organizations. In the years of lead, the Italian parliament was failing, as it had been doing so for decades, and featured no majority political party, only a strong communist party that did not represent the people's wishes. The historic compromise, an alliance between the Italian Communist Party and the declining conservative Democratic Christian Party, created a lot of tension in the government as it left a vacuum on the left that was eager to be filled. Activists viewed their cooperation as a statement to the working class public that their government did not support their people, and having no other political channels to express reform, they had to resort to violence. Due to the historic compromise and entrenched class warfare, the most salient reason for resulting terrorism was the spread of Marxist communism during the mid-1900s. The overarching economic and class conditions were so poor that it bred violence on both sides of the conflict, and extremist right-wing public attacks in the 60s triggered a revival of anti-fascism. The fear of a right-wing coup and the looming catalyst of capitalism spawned the perfect environment for ideologically charged action. This unjust division of labor and the pursuit of reordering it is claimed to give groups the right to combat. Arguably, the ultimate reason for Italian political terrorism was the social crisis, aka the rejection of long-held societal values which dismantled power structures in many facets of life. Sexual and ideological morals were thrown out the window, and the 3 M's were used to abbreviate the devaluing of mestiere, moglie, and macchina, or job, wife, and car. The Italian youth no longer saw a future nor wanted one, where the whole purpose of life was to work, marry, and reproduce. Along with these changes in societal values, secularism soon replaced the church's influence over the youth's social development. Now, instead of finding fulfillment in religion, people were finding it in armed revolt. Terrorists commonly long for a sense of fulfillment, different from the mainstream. Described by founding Brigate member Mara Kagol's sister, she said that Mara had a deep need to find answers to great problems. And her husband and fellow founder, Renato Curcio, wrote, "What more can I say? My enemies are the enemies of humanity and of intelligence." This video would be incomplete without mentioning the impact of the economic boom. The rapid modernization of the late 50s and early 60s way surpassed that of institution building in Italy. So the government was unable to handle the political instability, especially due to the mass internal migration from the south, which overwhelmed housing, hospitals, and schools. This extreme lack of political guidance and overall disorganization of government is what allowed niche areas of society to rise to influence in the absence of a strong state. During the years of lead, 24 major armed organizations from the left operated in Italy. The underlying aim across all leftist organizations was to target the foundation of society, the establishment and its aforementioned problems. First, it's important to mention a distinction often made by members of these organizations between armed struggle and terrorism, which provides necessary context to understanding members' motivations for joining and their actions. Terrorism seems to be negatively connotated with inflicting mass, indiscriminate violence on civilians, whereas armed struggle reflects the ideals of social movements of the past, which was their entire goal. In the Brigate Rosse manifesto, they claim their goal is a concentrated strike against the heart of the state because the state is an imperialist collection of multinational corporations. This violent Marxist doctrine was successful in motivating the left youth to commit acts of terrorism out of hatred for the government, which had put no priority on them and focused, instead, on hogging power and funding. Pioneering movements and groups in the late 60s, like Lotto Continua, I Potere Apparaio, triggered mobilizations in previously untouched parts of society, such as prisons, hospitals, the unemployed, and gender issues. The emergence of new and broader societal issues attracted the attention of the middle classes, professionals, and laborers alike, not just the youth and students. This, of course, gave rise to the intersectional Sesantotto and Autumno Caldo movements. More antiquated actions of social movements like sit-ins and student protests were soon overtaken by new leftist action via leaflets, sabotage, and vandalism. Newly formed Marxist-adjacent groups like the Prima Linea, Brigate Rosse, and Nuclei Armati Proletari retained a following through the years of lead because of these strategies. For the purpose of this video, when I give examples of political terrorism, I will mostly showcase the actions of the Brigate Rosse because of their infamy and plurality in Italy. As well, the economic boom played a large part in categorizing and commodifying the youth through the formation of subcultures and newly varied lifestyles. Striped t-shirts were a cheap and common piece in street markets, and so they became a symbol for the youth and laborers among different political organizations, as well as an ideological and socioeconomic marker in the 1960s when the years of lead began. So the question is, why turn to violence to express frustrations when many outlets for politics exist? It is often misconstrued that the average violent political actor is unique in their extremism. But the truth is that these actors arose from a larger movement that found violence was not only successful as an outlet for their frustrations, but more importantly, that it mattered more than any other actions that they had made in the past. A former member of the Brigate Rosse shared once that violence was an instrument to accelerate social change in historical processes, and that it could be used as a defense tool against official opposition. They later shared that many members would come to realize that the violence they had exercised had become similar to the violence from the state that they had criticized. From the perspective of another organization, a former member of Prima Linea shared that their violence responded to the micromechanisms of power and meant to serve as a social counter in day-to-day life. What causes the public to turn to violence is still debated, but a common theory states that when the opportunity arises to act, the most intuitive and impactful action will result, and this is more often than not violence, because of its permanency and severity. Next, I'd like to read a quote from Italian politician Luciano Promagnoli. Have you asked yourself why these thousands of young people who do not yet belong to any qualified political organization take part with such enthusiasm and drive in the struggles against fascism to affirm the ideals of the resistance? These young people link the attractions of these ideals to their own issues of wages, jobs, social advancement, the fight against discrimination, economic hardship, ignorance, and misery. Young people want to live better. They want to be respected. In the mid-1970s, the Italian police started to develop counterterrorism strategies based on intelligence gathering, a method adopted by the Western world shortly after. In 1975, a year following the kidnapping and murder of right-wing judge Mario Sossi by the Brigate Rosse, the Reale law was passed, allowing police to interrogate immediately upon arrest. These tactics, as well as anti-terrorism units, were used to arrest, charge, and bring down members of the Brigate Rosse in the late 80s. There was no doubt at their height, these organizations were a severe threat to national security and public order, which is why the Italian police were quick to squander them, and also why these organizations were quick to revive. At the very end of the 1980s, after 2 decades of action, came the major dissolution of leftist terrorism. Over 4,000 leftist political activists were brought to trial during these 20 years, with over half of them between 20 and 30 years old. On the screen, I have a breakdown of the 68 political activists who died during this period. Violence against the Italian government continued despite growing counterterrorism measures and the fall of larger organizations. In the 1990s and 2000s, it seemed that armed struggle reproduced out of spite rather than out of acting against the social conflict they originally sought to fight. We see this largely with the Nuovo Brigate Rosse and the spin-off Brigate Rosse Communist Combatant Party, who have both continued the sentiment of the original movement. I will keep displaying photos of political vandalism made by more recent armed organizations while I say thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you're able to learn something from it or see connections to current politics around the world, especially in our current political landscape. Thank you so much and goodbye.